Okay, so I should start with something of an apology. This video comes from a conversation that happened on the DVX user forums literally years ago when we were talking about using this stuff, LED sticky strip, we've all seen it, for various tasks in film and TV lighting work. And the concerns that people were having, that they were trying to follow instructions that have been posted on YouTube and various places, and they were having trouble terminating it and soldering wiring on the ends, rather like we see here. And because people like to use this to make flexible lights, and people use it in costume a lot as well, of course, it's then going to get flexed a lot. So it's important that it's well done. And at the end of this video, I'm going to do a quick demo of exactly how I would go about doing this. So if you haven't done much soldering before, and you'd like a little step-by-step way of getting out, I can't pull those off there. I'm unable to pull them off. So if you'd like to see how I did that, stick around for the end, and I'll just do a quick demo of it. What we should do first is have a quick chat about this, the ups and downs of using it, how it works and how it doesn't work. I think most people are aware that the really, really low cost stuff, of which this is an example, doesn't have very nice colours. You can see it's quite a sort of cool actinic white. They call this cool white. Incidentally, these dimmers, the one I'm using here to control this stuff, is something that I've had a little bit of interest in. So at some point we'll look into these, because these are quite easy to homebrew, but that'll be a subject for another day, I think. Anyway, you've got this cool white, which it's not a nice white. It's not something you'd want to, key light the star. But I've seen people use this in sort of medical and sci-fi sort of scenarios where they want it to look sort of cool and sort of cyanotic. You get a similar sort of look to a, nasty old cool white fluorescent tube. Different cameras all react in different ways, but I can see there being a use for that. The other option, of course, you can go for warm white. And people might go for warm white and think, well, I'll use that because it'll have more red in it and it'll be nicer on skin tones. And it's true, it does have more red in it. It's not that necessarily that much nicer on skin tones though, because this, as you can see with this stuff, it's sort of almost slightly greeny yellow. On camera, it looks nice in person, it looks like tungsten, but on camera it comes up rather yellow, and my pasty British flesh there, it ends up looking a little unhealthy. Maybe you could get away with it if you were doing a malaria ward scene or something like that. But that's the warm white, perhaps a little less useful than the cool. There are companies that do, I'm not going to endorse anybody, but there are companies that do very high quality versions of this. And there's stuff that's being sold on eBay now as high CRI. Now, maybe if one day, as I say, we'll do something about colorimetry, we'll talk about why CRI isn't necessarily a great metric of color quality, but there are things being sold at various prices which have improved performance. And then, of course, you get colors as well, which is sort of where the problems start for this as general lighting, because here we have green. This is a more modern green technology. It's a sort of emerald green, which is quite nice. And it looks, in reality, much as it looks on camera. If you can actually see into them, they clip out almost immediately because they're so intense. You can get red and blue as well. I've got some red over here and some blue. Which one's this? This is the blue. Blue tends to be a bit strange because it tends to look a little purple on camera because it's such a narrow spike in the spectrum. But you've got red, green, and blue. Let's look at the red while we're here. The red does work okay. It's quite a nice sort of ruby red, and it looks in reality again much as it looks on camera. And you'll think, well, that's great. We could do color mixing lights. We could do all kinds of things. We can build anything we want. And if you were to go and buy some of the high grade white stuff, you certainly can. And I know that because I've done it. And here it is. There we go. Now, you can see immediately the first problem with this is that after a while it comes unstuck quite spectacularly. Yeah, the best solution to that is something they call VHB tape, which is this stuff. It's sort of double-sided sticky tape, only Super Duty, and it's the kind of thing they use to stick batteries into cell phones and laptops and that sort of stuff. You can buy this online, just Google for VHB tape, you'll get a much better stickiness out of that if you're putting it somewhere where you want it to stay. That's worth knowing. But that's not the serious problem with this. Other than the colour quality issues, because the red, green and blue are very spiky, you can end up, if you want a yellow object illuminated, and you turn on the red and the green thinking that'll make yellow, and your yellow happens to not be in the, in the right point on the spectrum, then you will have trouble. But that's not really the problem. This can work to a degree, but if you stick it side by side like this in solid rows, you won't have a light, you'll have a campfire, or you'll have a puddle of melted plastic on the floor, because it won't stand doing this. It'll get too hot to do this. If you want to do that, there are perhaps other ways of doing it. You can do something more like this. Let's lose that so it's not so hard to look at. This is slightly less dense and the chips are smaller, they're lower power, so they don't generate quite so much heat. This was used quite extensively. It was a strobe and it was synchronized to gunfire, so you didn't get rolling shutter effects. But this is lower density. This works fine. Again, for a special purpose, and I wouldn't necessarily suggest building, your main lighting gear out of that. But this, don't do this. The other thing about it is that anything that made out of strip is always going to have these little black chip resistors on it. And that's really the key problem, however you space it out, because these are current limiting resistors. It's effectively ballasting the LEDs just like you ballast an HMI. And they're just wasting power. They're burning power to heat. And as a result, when you want an LED light, you want it because it's highly efficient. Well, this isn't that efficient because it's just burning all the extra power as heat. It's probably still better than a tungsten halogen light. It's probably not as good as a fluorescent or HMI. So this is something that you can do for special purposes. That's what this was done for, and it did its job fine. It was used once and thrown on the shelf. But in general, I wouldn't necessarily propose building stuff like this. However, whatever you do with sticky strip, once you get past the point where it's got this nice supplied end on it as you buy it, then you're going to need to do some soldering, and that's what we're going to do now. Okay, so this is what we do for soldering. You will need the piece of LED strip you're going to terminate, some bits of wire to terminate it to. Red and black is traditional. If you're doing several channels, you want to do some sort of color coding, at least make the negative black. That avoids throwing people a curveball. I've got a pair of combined pliers and strippers here. You can do it all with those. Sometimes it's easier to have a proper set of strippers. Stripping with cutters is bad form really, but I'll show it here just so we can get an idea of what can be done on the cheap. You'll need some solder. Now, frankly, tin lead solder is easier to use and does a better job than the lead-free stuff. I don't think there's a serious safety problem. Once I've finished handling this solder, I'll wash my hands before I eat anything, but that's not really a big deal. I've got a little model maker's vise here, which we'll use to clamp things we want to work on. You need to be gentle, but that works quite nicely. You can also get those helping hands things with little clips. They're fine. This is a little easier in terms of being able to show the camera what I'm doing, so that's better. And of course, a soldering iron. This is a very old but reasonably good one. If you want to go out and buy something, I would possibly think about one of those gas-powered ones. They take lighter fluid, butane or whatever. They're quite nice because they don't need power and they come up to temperature nice and quickly. Now, if you look at the tip of the soldering iron there's some junk stuck on it, so we'll wipe that off on the wet sponge. See, that looks shiny. That's as it should be. If it doesn't look like that, bit of solder on there after it's warmed up. The smoke you can see is a chemical reaction from the flux that's in the solder, which is designed to dissolve impurities and solve problems. If you've done that a couple of times and it still doesn't look shiny like that, then change the tip. But the trick here is that any soldering test will ask if you should carry solder to the job on the iron, and you shouldn't. You should never blob solder on the iron and then just try and sort of stick it on. It sort of can work, but it's a bit of a mess. So what we want to do is warm the copper pad up to the point where the pad itself, the copper, will melt the solder. Now to do that, I'm going to leave a tiny little bit on the end of the iron. That's just there to promote heat conductivity from the iron to the job. I'm going to sit that on the pad there, and I'm going to keep trying. Is it going to grab on? Is it going to grab on? And there it's grabbed on. And you see that the solder actually grabs onto the pad and forms a little puddle on the pad. You can show that again on the other one. Once again, clean the iron between joints. Tiny bit on the tip of the iron just for heat conductivity. Stick it on there. Is it going to grab on? And there you go. I'll probably put a little more on each of those just so there's a little kind of rounded nubbin of solder on each one. That makes it a lot easier when we come to solder things on. Now we need to prepare the ends of the bits of wire. Now I'm going to strip off way more of this sleeving than I need to. I'm going to take 10mm 3/8 of an inch off there. Again, bad form to strip with cutters, but you can do it. There you go, I've done it. What I'm then going to do is to twist like so it's all tidy. And I'm going to clamp it in the vise. Again, helping hands, whatever you're going to use. And again, I'm going to heat the wire and let the wire melt the solder. So tiny bit on the end of the iron, heat the wire. Now there's quite a bit of wire here. It's got to warm up that end bit, but ideally it should melt when it hits the wire. I'm not sticking the solder onto the iron, I'm sticking it onto the wire. And when we look at that, you can actually see the outline of the strands of wiring there. I'm going to cut that down to, well, how long does it need to be? I mean, what? 1/8 of an inch, if that. Going to trim that down to a very short length. So it's just long enough for the pad. See, that's even a little bit too long. Just see there. It's probably a third longer than it needs to be, so I'm going to trim that down a bit more. And that looks about right. So I'm now going to do the same thing with the black. Strip off way more than we need. Twist. Clamp it in the vise. I got a little bit quicker on this one. I did actually melt the insulation slightly on the last one because I was hanging around to show the camera what was going on. But tip of the iron's wet, heat up the piece of wire, flow the solder on like that, and you're done. In an ideal world, you should be able to see the twist of the wire through the solder like that. You don't need much. And there you go. Again, trim it down so it's an appropriate length. If we now clamp this, now I'm not really having to bring any solder to the job anymore because the solder's on the pad and on the end of the bit of wire. Might just add a little tiny touch more to that pad there, so there's a little bit more on there, and all I'm really doing is reflowing. I'm just melting the solder on the pad and on the wire and letting them come together. And there you have working LED strip. And the advantage of doing it that way is that I'm not at any point trying to get 3 things together that I can't clamp easily. And again, I am not able to pull that off there. That is absolutely rock solid. The only thing to say about this is if people want to make flexible LED panels, then if it's being flexed, then it will break. And the reason for that is because, of course, the joint is quite brittle. It's effectively been heat treated by the soldering iron. And you won't tear the wiring off the copper probably, but you will snap the wire just at the point where it goes into the ball of solder. And if you're going to make things that need to be flexible, particularly if they're going in costume, which is quite a common sort of use for this stuff, the cosplayers love that kind of thing. People who do replica movie costumes love that kind of stuff. It's all over the place. That will need extra reinforcement, but in general, that is really pretty good and works fine. And I think that people who are going to work behind a camera should have a ability to make a decent sort of solder joint, and I think that's a decent way of doing it. And boy, this warm white strip is green, isn't it? Anyway, there we go. Have fun.